Hello, I'm Sophia, and welcome to What We Need to Know About Ukraine. Here, I learn about Ukrainian history, literature, and culture, and share my findings with you. Today's episode is about one of the most famous Cossacks, Hetman Petro Konashevych-Sahaidachnyy, a person that contributed to Ukrainian culture, education, military history, and land. If you haven't listened to my third episode, Ukraine, Country of the Cossacks, I strongly recommend you do so before listening to this one. There, I explain what the Cossacks are and some technical terms. In other words, necessary information to understand this episode a little better. Before we begin, I need to mention that I will talk about Ukrainian lands where the Cossacks resided as part of a state called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It is important to understand that a very large part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was in Ukraine. It's not simply a Polish or a Lithuanian phenomenon. And in Polish as well as in Ukrainian, and I will say it with Ukrainian pronunciation, the state is called Rich Pospolita. Nothing to do with the names of Poland or Lithuania. Ukrainians were participating in the state as equals and not as subordinates. So, who is Petro Konashevych-Sahaidachnyy? Let's start with his name. Konashevych is Petro's actual last name, while the name Sahaidachnyy was given to him as a nickname by the Zaporizhian Cossacks. This happened since Sahaidak was a full archery set, and Petro was a brilliant archer. Petro Konashevych-Sahaidachnyy was a nobleman. He even had his own coat of arms. And he was born in western Ukraine in a town near Lviv in the early 1580s. Sahaidachnyy was well educated. He went to school and to university, and after graduating moved to Kiev, where he worked as a private teacher and an assistant of a judge. At some point, Petro decided to join the Zaporizhian siege, which is where he gained his reputation and started leading sea campaigns. One of such campaigns attributed to Sahaidachnyy was the sea campaign to Varna in the summer of 1606. During this campaign, the Cossacks captured a fortress that had been considered impregnable before. The storming of Varna ended with the destruction of all coastal fortifications and Ottoman ships that were on the raid. The result of the battle was the liberation of several thousand prisoners and the capture of significant trophies, as well as 10 Ottoman galleys with cargo and crew. And this is the time that piracy starts to emerge in Europe, and they are independent military communities which are similar to the Cossacks in that way. Since I dare draw the comparison of the Cossacks to pirates, I need to emphasize that it is only in that sense that they are similar. And for the record, Sahaidachnyy was very strict when it came to alcohol, and none was to be consumed during campaigns by any Cossack. After Sahaidachnyy gained his reputation, he became Hetman of the registered Cossacks in 1616, and is considered the first real Hetman and not just a leader. For a reminder of what the registered Cossacks are, you can listen to Ukraine, Country of the Cossacks episode. And he also at the same time was the head of the Zaporizhian siege, which means that he took up two of the most prestigious and important positions in the Cossack world. They are, of course, not connected, let's call them organizations, but they did work really closely together, and being the head of both is quite an achievement. Especially if we remember the democracy that went on, and that Sahaidachnyy was chosen by the Cossack populations for all the positions of power he obtained. Some think he was elected because he promised a larger campaign than the one the Cossacks previously fought in. This promised campaign was the Battle of Kaffa, today's Feodosia in Crimea. Utilizing their wit, power, and military skills, the Cossacks have succeeded in the campaign, and the Turkish fleet of 10,000 boats was destroyed by the Cossacks, which were way smaller in numbers. The next campaign, only the second one led by Sahaidachnyy, was a very ambitious one too, the storming of Istanbul. Of course, that just made Sahaidachnyy more and more popular, until the Cossacks were hired to fight alongside the Polish-Lithuanians against Moscow. At first, the campaign against Moscow was successful, but soon the Cossacks were pushed out of Moscow's territory, and their endeavors failed. This made Sahaidachny lose popularity. The other thing that made him lose popularity was that the authorities of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth decided to create a government commission for negotiations with the Zaporizhians, and the aim of this commission was to stop the Zaporizhians from going on sea campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. The meeting of this commission was scheduled, which even the possibility of angered the Cossacks. An unsuccessful campaign in Moscow, as well as the Cossacks' rejection of the government commission, led to growing dissatisfaction with Sahaidachny's foreign policy, as since he was the one that let these things happen. So a year after Sahaidachny was elected as Hetman, he was removed from power by the election of another Hetman. Yet this didn't last long, and the same year Sahaidachny returned to being Hetman, after some serious strategic mistakes made by his both successor and predecessor. Sahaidachny, after all, was a military and a strategic genius, and he organized his campaigns very, very well. Before we look at two of Sahaidachny's most famous endeavors, let's talk about his military skills and innovations that made him stand out from other military strategists of the time. Petro Sahaidachny won using exclusively non-standard at the time tactics and decisions. The essence of his defense was the use of tactics of offense, surprise, fighting at night, and preventative attacks, which, by the way, were tested in many successful sea campaigns. He made sure that every Cossack had a rifle and not a bow and arrows as their main weapon, as was before him, but Petro also fought really well on land. Sahaidachny introduced many innovations in the army, including light and maneuverable artillery, well-armed and trained infantry. It should not be forgotten that it was Petro Sahaidachny who perhaps was the first ever to actively use the tactics of ambushes and counterattacks against the enemy, and this is how he did it. A few units of well-trained Cossacks attacked the marching columns of the enemy, although they were outnumbered by 10 times. They then introduced disorder and panic into the ranks of the enemy. In general, Sahaidachny's military strategies and tactics were designed to work in conditions of numerical superiority of the enemy, while the decisive blow always struck instantly and at the weakest point of the opponent. One cannot fail to note the high mobility of the Cossack army, which at times stopped the advance of the Turkish Tatar hordes with effective strikes on their rear communications. Ukrainian historian Alexander Alfyorov says, quote, Sahaidachny is the father of the new Ukrainian condition, the Cossacks which took shape under him, which entered the international political arena and announced its plans to build an independent state at that time. Of course, Sahaidachny did not solve everything with force and military power. He was also a great politician. He did not go into open political confrontation with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but he used diplomacy to establish and implement his policy. Sahaidachny fought for the expansion of the Cossack registry, and in other ways tried to legalize and officially recognize the Cossack military and political organization, expand Cossack rights, withdraw Polish troops from Ukraine, establish religious equality. He understood that every step, even a small step forward in this matter, would contribute to the strengthening of the position of the Ukrainian people and orthodoxy. For the first time under Sahaidachny, the Cossacks formed their own political program, in which they go beyond the narrow interests of the state. A union of Cossacks, the bourgeoisie, and the clergy is formed. Thanks to him, the concept of the Ruthenian, meaning Ukrainian people, as the third equal to the Polish and Lithuanian people of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was established in society. Quote, our Ruthenian people joined the Polish people as equals to equals, as free to free. Historian Hrushevsky wrote that the contemporaries highly valued the political talent of Sahaidachny. He wrote, quote, Sahaidachny was praised by his contemporaries as a very intelligent, profound politician who knew how to put the Cossacks at service of national affairs and made the Cossack army a pillar of national Ukrainian life. End quote. Sahaidachny opened a new era of the history of Ukrainian life. And now let's talk about one of his most famous campaigns. In 1618, Sahaidachny joins the Polish-Muscovite War, which was a Polish attempt of getting Moscow's throne, and leads a campaign against Moscow with 20,000 Cossacks. The siege was quite successful in a sense. The Muscovites were terrified and decided to start discussing terms of peace with the Poles. And the Cossacks were troops hired by the Polish-Lithuanian king in this instance, so they did not take part in the peace treaty. This did in fact result in a peace treaty, which was just incomprehensible to Sahaidachny. He wanted to finish off what he had started, but the peace was signed regardless. Petro is sometimes criticized for almost defeating Moscow and then folding, since such was the decision of the Poles. The consequences of that are the ongoing wars between Ukraine and Moscow. Yet the siege of Moscow had also wonderful consequences, since some Ukrainian lands were returned. One of them is Chernihiv region, which is still part of modern-day Ukraine. Another event that Sahaidachny is known for is the battle that saved Europe. So, how did he save Europe? Let's see. In 1620, the Turkish Sultan decided to hold a campaign against Warsaw, and most likely go even further into Europe and conquer. The first few battles, the Poles tragically lost along with their best military leaders, so the Ottomans advanced. The Poles then reluctantly asked the Cossacks for help, and the famous Battle of Khotyn began. At first, there was another Cossack who was Hetman when the battle began. He made tactical mistakes and was quickly removed. Sahaidachny was then re-elected as Hetman once again. It was quite quick and unexpected, but he needed to continue the fighting in the battle. The Ottomans had around 300,000 soldiers. Meanwhile, the Cossacks only had around 40,000. Together with the Poles, their army was 75,000 men, which is still less than a third of the Ottoman army. The Turks underestimated the Cossack army of Sahaidachny, and if you look at the battle plans, you will see that the Turks most often attacked the Cossack redoubts, which are temporary fortifications, and tried to knock out this very element. It can definitely be said that the Cossack army bore the brunt of the Khotyn battle. Fantastically enough, Sahaidachny's army won, and the Ottoman campaign was stopped. If not for the Cossacks, the Polish army would be defeated in 3 to 4 days. The dynamic and flexible battle tactics of the Cossack army, in contrast to the positional, inflexible tactics of the Polish army, was a decisive factor in this brilliant victory in the Battle of Khotyn. But the battle for Sahaidachny was fatal. He died a year later in Kiev from the wounds he received in the Battle of Khotyn. Before his death, he wrote a will, and most of his wealth went to Lviv, Kiev, and other fraternal schools. The Kiev school later became the Kiev Mohyla Academy, but it should be noted that he was supporting educational institutions in Ukraine his entire life. Of course, a person may win a battle, but will not go down in history since there was little importance that came with it. So what are some larger scale achievements of Sahaidachny's? As to the Cossacks themselves, he makes them truly an organized and disciplined army. The Cossacks also then become a political force under him. He makes the Cossacks popular and well known throughout Europe. Sahaidachny was the one who laid down the foundation for another fascinating figure, Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who will have his own episode eventually. Under Sahaidachny, the registered Cossacks have their own judicial system and their own courts, which means that the Polish-Lithuanian royal court has no power and cannot put any registered Cossack on trial. During Sahaidachny's hetmanship, the Cossacks officially become the protectors for the Christian Orthodox Church. This also becomes a national identity. In the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where Sahaidachny was born and to where Ukrainian lands belonged at the time, people first and foremost associated themselves with their religion, as we today associate ourselves with our nation. It is only in the 1800s that will start to change, and people will develop more of a national identity similar to ours today. Borders changed frequently, and therefore you would associate yourself with your religion or town rather than country. So the Cossacks, being the official protectors of the Christian Orthodox Church, also gave the Cossacks a sort of national identity. When thinking of what Sahaidachny did for Ukraine long term, then the following comes to mind. Not only did he return some of the Ukrainian lands taken by the Muscovites, but also it is at this time that the active formation of the national Ukrainian community, with its clearly defined geographical boundaries, takes place. Sahaidachny also has a decisive role in this, because it was him who once again involved Kiev in the future new Ukrainian Cossack state. With Petro, Kiev once again becomes the political center of the new Ukraine. A view of Ukrainians being a self-sufficient political community is formed on the international arena. At the same time, the Cossacks began to be recognized on an equal footing with the nobility as an integral component of the legitimization of the Ukrainian nation. Thank you so much for joining me today, and this is what we need to know about Ukraine this week.